All right, thank you. A little bit more about my background. I actually went to high school here. I grew up just south of Whitman, and then my family moved to Wyoming, and so it's always good to be back in this area. This is the Goodman's and Sandhills lab here, and a lot of the data I'm going to show was collected in cages like this. And we move these every year to capture areas that had been grazed last year, and then we'll collect the data typically in August. This is Nathan Kluger. He was a graduate student of mine, probably cussing me right about here because we have quite a few of these out there that we have to clip, and we separate them out by plant function group. And so that's what we're going to get into more on. And these started. We have two different data sets I'm going to talk about. One at Goodman's and Sandhills lab there north of Whitman. The other one is the Bard Brothers Ranch south of Bass. And these go back to right around 2000. So we have this record that we've kept every year. So about 22 years of data. I was just graduating high school then too. So it's long before my time being here that they started. So it's pretty open. Feel free to ask questions. We pretty casual here, but drought. It's this is kind of a perpetual thing that we always worry about going into the growing season. We're going to have drought, and thankfully a lot of years it doesn't come to fruition, but some years it does. And I was speaking with somebody the other day, and he said it's a year that ends in 2, so we're bound to have drought. Because the last big ones were 2002, 2012, and so that was his big concern. So last year there were some concerns. This is in early March when we started having a few concerns, and you remember I don't know if you guys had it here, but Scotts Bluff we had a massive blizzard come through mid-March last year, and so we were ramping up to give a talk about drought, and then that blizzard hit, and concerns really kind of went down after that blizzard. But it still ended up being pretty dry last year in Scotts Bluff. How about you guys? How was last year? Not too bad. At Goodman's, where I have the data, they got real timely rains, and so it ended up being a little bit below average, but it was timely enough that it kind of kept that grass growing pretty well. But this is just kind of highlight how variable our precipitation can really be. In Scotts Bluff County now, we're about 3/4 of it. Well, we were about 3/4 of an inch for March, so not far off average. April's been fairly dry though. I know it's been up here too. And so just kind of give an overview of where we're at. I'm going to go through a number of tools here at the end, but this is the drought monitor. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. Just kind of highlights the best estimates this group of climatologists can to kind of highlight where the drought's at. And they have us here in a moderate drought. As we go farther east, we get into more severe and even extreme droughts. Same with as you go farther west. But I think that part of that is because of those timely rains last year, but still really coming into a pretty dry time. And so this is our departure from normal precipitation over the water year. So from October to October is how they measure this, but here we are in April, so it's not the full year. But we're definitely in a deficit, especially again as you move east. And when we look at this on a percentage basis, this is like 25% of normal and less in some of these areas farther here. We're somewhere in the 25 to 50% range as far as our departure from normal. So yeah, really a dry winter, as I'm sure you all know. And it's not looking great. So this is from the Climate Prediction Center. Everything in brown is where they say this drought is likely to persist over the course up until July 31st. Now these are really have a lot of models that come into these. They're not always 100% right, and so it could, but typically they have pretty good predictions, especially short-term predictions. You get these longer ones, there's still a little bit of haziness in them, but probably the best available data that we have as far as predicting what that drought's going to look like. And so to start off, I kind of wanted to take a really kind of, it's a global view of why we have drought and what are the variables that play into that. And so this is some work that was done with the Agricultural Research Service, ARS, USDA, where they were looking at these Pacific decadal oscillation and the El Nino Southern oscillation. So it's basically the Pacific decadal oscillation is right here along the west coast of the Pacific Ocean, and it's sea surface temperatures. And then the El Nino Southern oscillation is right here along the equator. And so the red indicates a warm El Nino year. The blue indicates a La Nina. So it's when it's cold, it's La Nina. When it's warm, it's El Nino. And then they have different cycles. So typically the Pacific decadal oscillations over a 20 to 30 year cycle, or 10 to 30 year cycle. If it's warm phase, typically that's the years we have pretty good average or above rainfall here in the Great Plains. If it's cold, there's a lot of high variability. So the last one, cold phase, was between 1999 and 2013, where we had like years like 2002 and 2012. Then we also had years like 2009, which was really a wet year. And so it's kind of this interplay between this longer cycles and then these shorter cycles of El Nino and La Nina. El Nino, we have wet conditions. La Nina, we have dry conditions. So these are the temperatures. And so blue, it's cold, red's warm, obviously. And right now we're coming off of where it was warm for a period here. We've had, it's been fairly above average rainfall. From I started in 2015. Really, 2015 to 2020, we're actually pretty average or above average years in Scotts Bluff there. But then we've hit this kind of cool phase here, and then just recently, it's a La Nina advisory. So these are actual temperatures on April 6th of the Pacific Ocean here, and it's an anomaly. So it's departure from normal. As you can see, it's tending to be more of the cool waters in the Pacific Ocean. So what does this mean? It's basically estimated or favored to continue in the northern hemisphere. It says there's a 59% chance that that'll be June to August that it stays cool, and then about a equal chance, 50-55% chance through the fall. And all this data you can find on the Climate Prediction Center to see that. Dr. Rayner, E.J. Rayner, he was here at Nebraska for a while, but now he's working with USDA ARS in Colorado there. There we go. They put together this, they have a long data set of livestock performance. Like it goes back 70, 80 years in some of those areas in Cheyenne and in eastern Colorado. And so what they did is they started looking at that, and they started to look at the Pacific decadal oscillation and the El Nino patterns, and they were able to kind of piece together through all these years maybe a game plan of when to destock and when to hold normal, and even when maybe to increase our stocking rates based on these predictions with these climates. And so as I said before, we're in this cold Pacific decadal oscillation here right now. It's a moderate to strong La Nina event, and they're recommending that we would decrease these this year based off those sea surface temperatures. If we were being a cold, and if really that El Nino event, if it's cold phase, it can be hard to determine. But if it's a warm decadal oscillation, El Nino, typically we're going to have a pretty good year. So just to that global view, again, this is models that come into play here. And so they may not be 100% accurate. So that's why I have a question mark about it. But it's looking like we're going to be carrying on into a drought this year. And one thing, though, that if you really look back at our historic weather patterns, drought's fairly common. It doesn't make it easy, but it's part of our system. So this is a standardized precipitation evaporation index. And so what that is basically they take the averages of precipitation and then also add in some of the evapotranspiration of plants. So that's tied a lot with the heat, so how hot it is. And they pull this into an index. So if it's white in here, that would mean that it's basically average. If it's blue, that means it was a really wet year. And if it's the brown, it was a really dry year. So this little peak right here, this is 2012, right here. And so as you look back past this, and this I collected this. This is data that was modeled, but from Whitman area. Really, this is that 2009, 10, 11 right here, really wet. This is 18, 19 right here. Again, kind of wet periods right here, followed by extremely dry. You can see 2012 is one of the driest that we've ever had in the last. I think this goes back to 1980 or 1800, 1885, 1895 that they have this for. But I just want to highlight, all these droughts here, 2012, 2002, late 80s right here. Then we get back here, there were some in the 70s. Down here in the 50s, there was a pretty bad one. This is the 30s right here. And as we look past this whole record, we definitely had some dry years throughout here, especially this single year, 2012 especially. But the 30s were a really hard time, and this is why. They had a period between about 7 years of almost every year was below average. So not to paint a rosy story or anything about it, but definitely that was one of the worst times there. We haven't had that recently over extended, thankfully. But it is always a concern. And so as we talk about drought resilience or resilience of our working landscapes, typically we needed to start that several years ago. We're kind of if it really does come into a drought, we're kind of at an emergency room phase, whereas the idea is that before you get to the emergency room, you're practicing preventative health in a sense, and making sure that your rangelands are as healthy as possible, so they have that resilience going into the drought, so they can come in on the other side of it as strong as they were before. And so these are kind of typical things that we talk about as far as rangeland management and what we can do to alter our grazing and manage for more rangeland health. And so when we think about stocking rate, that's probably the most important thing that we have to hit on. This is at the Goodmanson Sandhills lab from 2004 to 2021. This is our average production. So we're at about 1,800 pounds of dried plant material per acre. If the NRCS, they typically use air dried, so it's about 10% more than that. So there's a little bit of difference there, but we try to dry our forage down as much as we can to take out all the water for our estimate. So 812 pounds. If you calculate that out on an animal unit months per acre, it comes in somewhere in the neighborhood of about 0.65 to 0.7, somewhere in there. And if we figure a cow-calf pair is about 1.5 animal unit months, so I'm thinking about a 1,200 pound cow, 300 pound calf at its side on average over the summer. They're going to be eating about 1,000 pounds of dry matter now this is a rough estimate, but these are typically numbers that we go with. If you're thinking hay, it's probably closer to 1,200, maybe a little bit more than that. But it kind of boils down to about, it's roughly around 12 acres per cow-calf pair over that 5-month growing season is where we figure close averages on where we should be stocking. According to this, where we leave half of the plant bigger, we assume that there's loss. Wildlife, trampling, insects, it may be that corner of the pasture they never go to. Some of those types of things are added into this 25 in a sense. And then we figure about 25% of that production is being consumed by that cow. And that's how we come with these numbers. But as we think about this, if it's poor range condition, there's poor livestock distribution. Sometimes if it's been season long, continuously grazed heavy for a lot of years, you may have shifted that plant community, and it's going to require a little bit more acres for that cow-calf pair. And then obviously if it's dry conditions. So flexibility ends up being really critical in how we manage some of these stocking. So the next thing is timing of grazing, and this is really where I see as the rotation provides a lot of value into the system. Now I think if you're stocked correctly, a season-long continuous can work, and you can still have most of your pasture being really sustainably managed in that way. But if we add in some of these, even just a simple poor pasture deferred rotation, one of the things you're doing is rotating when that piece of ground or that grass is being grazed. So this is some studies by Pat Reese, that was here before I was, where he looked at timing of defoliation. They went out and they actually flipped these plants really heavily. This was on sand bluestem plants. And then they dug up the roots and they measured that relative to the amount that they would have if they just let that plant grow clear to October. And what they found is that if especially if you graze twice or heavily defoliated in June and August, that really reduced the amount of root material on those plants. And even if you did just once in June or once in August, it tended to reduce that root material there. But so by rotating when you're grazing in a pasture, oftentimes you're able to avoid that, especially in those areas that get really heavy. And so you can shift that time of grazing. And then also, as we think about this distribution of grazing, and so we put GPS collars on cows out of Goodmanson for several years now, and we're just starting to kind of look at that data more closely and see how that works. And so we looked at it at different topographic positions. So we're thinking like in between the dunes, on the dune slopes, that ridge of the dunes, and their selection ratio. So this figure here basically is if it's above the 1, that means that they're selecting it more than what's available out there. If it's below, they're avoiding it. So the lowlands and flat plains, typically, we'd probably expect that, right? Those cattle are going to be grazing those at a heavier rate than they are some of the open slopes and uplands where they have to work a little harder. Now this is another example that we have out there, and this is 3 years of data that we have grazing this pasture. This is right above the home place there. If you've been to the Goodmanson Sandhill spot, where they have a pasture. It's about 400 acres. We oftentimes have a lot of cattle up there that we do different studies on. So we keep them close there so we can bring them in several times. And so we wanted to put collars on those to see how they would utilize that landscape during the summer growing season. And so with those collars that we saw that there were some of these areas that had 0 to 3 hours over the whole growing season that they had cows grazing. And then on the flip side of that, we had areas that were up to 32, and even at the highest, which were close to water, is where they ended up being. But we could attribute about 32 to 240 cow hours on that per acre on some of those pixels. Now, this is relative to the number of collars we have out there, but I think it just highlights this huge difference in how cattle we utilize pasture. That there's this 20 or 30% that they were just really hitting all summer long, and some of these other places where they really didn't hit much.
What does it take? Does it take like the time where they're at? How many times a day? It's recorded like 24 hours a day.
Like what time of day are they usually in some of these areas?
Yeah, I mean, is the satellite signal, is it at 10 o'clock in the morning every day?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it all day long?
10 minutes, every 10 minutes.
Every 10 minutes.
Yeah. And so this goes from typically end of May through about August. So yeah, we know that they're hitting some of these areas, and I had a grad student go out there last year and start looking at some of these areas. And we have slightly different plant communities. You know, we see more blue grama, we see more, and so, especially on the lowlands, the flat areas, we see more blue grama. We have slightly more annual invasives that have come into some of these areas that get grazed a little bit heavier compared to their counterparts that aren't. We see more Scribner's rosette grass. We have more Kentucky bluegrass, which really, and Kentucky bluegrass is not all bad. It's really pretty nutritional and has high palatability, and I think that's what cattle typically get in there and graze it quite a bit. And so is it a chicken or an egg thing? I think we've started to see those plants shift over the years and years that we graze out in some of these areas. These other areas are very typical, though, of what we'd see as fairly good quality range. So we have both poor or less. I don't know if it's quite poor, but it's not as good a quality of rangeland as what we would expect to be out there, and that's okay sometimes. This isn't all bad. There's certain species that will utilize some of this lower growing vegetation. They need that. There's ground nesting bees that need more bare ground. So having some more bare ground out there might not be that bad in some of those cases too. So it just balances. this kind of highlights this a little bit. Now it's not perfect, and I don't have all the slides for this, but this was the darker blue is at the Bar Brothers Ranch, and the Bar Brothers Ranch is smaller pastures, higher stock density, probably about at least double the stock density that we had out here. Still not really high stock density, but it is. So we were in these pastures about a month is what it ended up being. So smaller pastures, and really what we saw is that they tended to use these open slopes almost to where it was neutral. And so when we looked at all the pixels, like we took this pasture and gridded it out and did that on all of them, what we found is that at Bar Brothers Ranch, it typically was more uniform to where we would think it would be. So there was a lot more pixels that were kind of in the middle of how we would expect them to graze, whereas places like this have a lot on each end. So they have a lot of pixels that are either not grazed or a lot of pixels that are really heavily grazed. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's the key, right? Is being able to that you can have that higher stock density, shorter time period, they tend to get a better, more uniform distribution across there. They'll probably still hit these areas a little bit harder, but typically in a rotation of some sort, you're able to move them off. And so those areas are able to cut. And they don't just get hit time and time again. But like I say, I mean, there's probably benefits to having some areas like this and other places that you manage a little bit more intensively. So I show this a lot, but I just think it's really cool. This is John Weaver, ecologist at University of Nebraska. And he saw this distribution gradient out in some of their pastures too, over by Lincoln. And they went out to this pasture and they dug up these little blue stem plants, and they cut out chunks like this, took them back to campus and let them grow. And then they harvested them, sprayed off all the roots, and this is what they found. And so this was in an area that typically cattle had perpetually overgrazed. And this was that little blue stem plant with its roots. This was kind of a moderate area, and then this one was kind of at the farther end of the pasture with cattle. I think they had to kind of get up on a slope a little bit, so they didn't really get over to it very much. So it didn't get a lot of grazing here, probably appropriately grazed here, and then not grazed at all here. And so really, I think it highlights this from the standpoint of thinking of things like getting carbon into the ground. Also, when we think about resilience, being able to survive some of these droughts, which one has the most resilience? And so yeah, it really, this one is probably going to suffer from the drought. So this is data that's part of this. It's collected with this prism, and I'll give you these addresses. They're on some of the handouts that I have. I'll go through some of these tools a little bit more, but this is also another way that we can look back in time at some of our long-term precipitation levels. And so again, this is from Goodman's and Sandhill's lab, and this is back from the 1930s. And so here's the 30s drought, and what really made it hard was this. This is May, June, July. Those are the key months for precipitation in the Nebraska Sandhills. But we had several years here that were just really dry. Then we come and now we see that we were pretty close to average a lot of years. This is 2002. They had a few dry years there. 2012, this is 2006, 98, I think is that one. And then just some tremendously wet years as well. But I think it's important we have an understanding of where we're at and what we can expect in terms of that precipitation on the landscape. And so this is it's a mixture of that previous data and actual data that we were collecting at the ranch. We have a weather station there that's collected data for 15 years or somewhere in that neighborhood, maybe a little bit longer. But this orange line here, that's our average. So we're somewhere in that neighborhood of 19 to 20 inches of precipitation there on average. This was 2021, and so we dried out later in the year. But I think early on we had okay precipitation. It was above average until we got to about June and July, August there. And then this was 2012, blue here. And then this was 2009 here. It's tremendously wet here. And this is where we're at right now. So it's not looking great. And so a state climatologist, we were talking, we're in the for the whole state of Nebraska, we're talking, top 5 in dry January, February, March, April. So that's kind of that's kind of where we're at. And so it's troublesome, it's worrying. And I'm really hoping we'll have a good system come through in the next few days that helps us with that. But this is why it's so important. We look at that May, June, July precipitation. Now the whole year is important, right? But it just seems that these 3 months end up being the most critical for our rangeland. And so it's somewhere between 45 and 50% of our annual precipitation falls within those months. It comes out to roughly around 2.5 to 3.5 inches each month. That's kind of where the average is at. And so when we think about our plant growth, right? So our plant growth is adapted to that precipitation patterns that we have. So most of our growth, so we think our cool season grasses and our warm season grasses, most of our growth occurs in that May, June, July period. And so this is all that data we've been collecting. This is what it comes out over the last 15 or so, 15, 20 years here, is our warm season grasses, somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 50% of our biomass. Cool season grasses, 25 to 30%. Then forbs and shrubs are in there as well. And this is what the NRCS would say that it should grow. So on the bottom is months. They're saying that by April, so March and April, we should have only about 10% of our growth out there on our landscape. It's a variable depending on the years, but somewhere in that neighborhood of 10%. May, we should get about 15% more. So that's about 25% of our total growth. By June, we should have 50% of our total growth out there on our rangelands. And so understanding these growth curves is really helpful in understanding what months the precipitation is most critical. In July, we should get another 30%. And that's mainly because of a lot of our warm season grasses. So a total of about 80% of our growth should happen between March and July. And so August, September, there's opportunities, especially for some of our cool season growth in the fall, but typically that doesn't add a whole lot to that total amount. And so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. This is every year of that biomass production at the Goodman's and Sandhill's lab. So this is warm season grasses, cool season grasses, and this is others, so forbs and shrubs. And then this is our precipitation here. That kind of shows there's a definite pattern there with that May, June, July, and I'll go into that a little bit more. What I want to highlight here, though, is this 2012. So really dropped down less than, I think it was right around 2 inches or less of that May, June, July precipitation from that time. And then also 2013 and how that response was. So this is a slide, Dr. Jerry Valesky, this was before I was here, but this is it's a dry flat as you go to the east of the home place there. And this is what it looked like in August 2012. This is what it looked like in August 2013. I think this was probably pretty common throughout the Sandhills, where we just saw this tremendous flush of annual forbs that took it. So some of our grasses were set back, and then really there was an opportunity for those forbs to come in. Conditions were right; they really came on. Now this is a pattern we see in a lot of places, and we have these periodic amounts of different forbs, mare's tail, lamb's quarter, that show up in the panhandle as well during these drought years. But as you can see, a majority of our biomass in 2013 was attributed to these annual forbs. And so it's kind of, I think, a coping mechanism for our rangelands. So I think it's kind of a neat thing because we look at 2014, we started to see them go back to normal. So it was kind of a single year that we did that. One thing though that we did see is, look at this, our warm season grasses. It really took some time for them to come up to where they were closer to that normal amount we typically see out there. So there was some recovery that needed to happen on this landscape. And I think we're probably getting close. It does seem to shift a little bit. We after that 2012 drought, we did see more cool season grasses come into this landscape, and we did see, and so I'm thinking we may have saw some mortality on some of our warm season grasses at this location. So this is a research project that was done. I think it's kind of a neat project. What they did out there is they went out and they actually sprayed glyphosate on the landscape, a fairly good size area. And what their goal was to see is, what if we killed all the vegetation? How is it going to respond after we do that? And what they found is that the areas that they did that glyphosate on, compared to areas that were controls or they didn't do anything on, that had a very similar effect to the above ground biomass the 2012 drought did, and that it also increased the amount of soil nitrate and ammonium, and it reduced the net and mineralization and also soil carbon flow. So it reduced the amount of carbon going into the soil, essentially is what it did. But the reason we see some of these forbs really take off the year after is this drought increases that nitrogen in the soil. And so these annual forbs just take advantage of that when they get the precipitation that comes on. And if we have more bare ground, all the better. But what they really, after several years of this study, they indicated that Nebraska sandhills are resilient to climate and vegetation disturbance on decadal timescales, and that continued below ground functioning is critical to the stability of the ecosystem. So I thought they left this with a measure of hope in this, that our landscapes are fairly resilient to drought. They can handle it. If we can help them out with how we graze, that's all the better, and gives them more opportunity to recover. So this is kind of a graphic. Again, this is from Dr. Jerry Gillespie, but looking at these carbohydrate reserves, this is kind of a classic model of thinking about it. But the red is our carbohydrate reserves stored in the rhizomes, the roots, the crowns of the plants. Early in the growing season, they have to use some of that energy to start the leaf material. Once it gets out to just 2 to 4 leaf stage, typically that's enough for the photosynthesis to take over. And once that photosynthesis takes over, it's able to produce more and put more down into carbohydrate reserves. But if we have a drought, or if we have a drought and maybe heavy grazing, or even just heavy grazing without a lot of precipitation afterwards, we see that can be stunted. And so typically that stunts the growth on top, which plays into that carbohydrate reserve going back to the roots. So when we start next year, we're going to start at a lower amount of carbohydrates that it's going to have to use to get those plants up and running. And not only that, we typically see fewer reproductive tillers, earlier plant maturity, we reduced bud formation, that will affect the number of tillers the next year, and then increase annual fruits. But this is kind of when you think about that schematic of during drought, we have reduced herbage production. That affects the cover that we have out there, the reduced infiltration of the roots, and then reduced soil moisture, but it also plays in lower energy. So it's lower plant vigor and less root growth. So it's kind of a cycle that plays on one another between the plant and soil. And oftentimes, it's just, we typically in drought, it's sometimes hard to leave that 50% plant vigor. It's hard to leave the amount that we'd have out there when we want an average. So if we have 1,800 pounds, that means we're leaving 900 pounds out there if we're only taking half. When we have years where we only get 1,000 pounds, it's pretty tough to get 900 pounds. So we try to leave as much as we can out there on that landscape. Now I like to go back into history, and this is kind of a neat study, I think, that started way back in the 1920s I believe this was at the forest over there, where they were looking, and this is little blue stem, this line here, and this is hairy grama, this line here. Where basically they saw that 7-year drought period had a pretty profound effect on little blue stems. It really dropped in the numbers they were seeing. So this is how frequently it was observed across the landscape. It went from about 90% all the way down to 30%. And then there was a break. If they collected data in the 40s here. Then there was a break all the way to 1979. When they came back in 1979, it was back. And so it was able to recover after that kind of really, really bad drought. Hairy grama, on the other hand, tended to not recover quite as well. But again, this is John Weaver, and he had studies all across Nebraska after the 30s, and he had areas where he said there was losses of up to 90 to 100% of the little blue stems. And so little blue stem tended to be really hit hard by that drought that happened in the 1930s. And it varies some as you go across the state, but in this area, little blue stem is probably one of our bigger biomass producers. It could be 20-30% of our total biomass that comes from blue stem. This is just a study in the Panhandle looking at needle and thread, our most important warm season grass in terms of the biomass production. This was a study 2002 where they went out and they clipped plots, and so they clipped so they could know that they clipped 40% of that plant material, or they clipped 80% of that plant material. And then they went back to the same plots the next year, And if it was non-defoliated, or if it was only 40%, they tended to hold on to their production. But if it was heavily grazed in late May, it really saw a reduced amount of biomass. Another data set, this is at the Barter Brothers Ranch, and this is a little bit longer data set, so we use this one a little bit more for some of our models. But this is generally our plant production per acre. And so this is our average, and it's roughly about the same. So it's about 1,850, 1,900 pounds is kind of where we're at per acre on average. And this is where it's at 75%, or where I'd say we're seeing the effects of the drought. And this is where it's at 125%. Well, that's a really good year, like 2019. And so we had 5 years in the past 22. I wasn't able to get the other two on this graph. Sorry about that. But 5 years in the last 22 years that meet that threshold below 75% of biomass. And this is where they were at. So in 2002, our lowest year, we had 884 pounds, and that was only 47% of the average. Whereas in 2019, we had 150%. So 3 times difference in the amount of biomass that's out there, depending on our driest and wettest years. Then we had several that were in that 60 to 75% range. 2002, interestingly enough, at the Barter Brothers, really wasn't as severe that following year. It tended to respond back a little bit better following 2002. But so we tried to run a lot of models on this data, and these are 2 of the ones that I think are the easiest to kind of get our minds wrapped around. There's some, if we look at fall precipitation, that adds a little bit, or temperature adds some too in a lot of years. But really, this is the number of days with precipitation greater than 1/10 of an inch, and that's our best model. And so what this R squared tells you is the amount of variability around that line. That if R squared is 1, that means that every point lines up exactly on that. So 0.85 is pretty good in terms of how it explains our plant production. So basically, what this is saying is that for every day we have at least 1/10 of an inch of precipitation, we get about 80 pounds per acre of biomass in August, and that's when we clip these. The model also works if we think about total precipitation. It's just not quite as strong, but it's basically about 91 pounds per acre more vegetation for every inch that we get in May, June. So really, it's a way that we can think about this in terms of where we're at. This is the Barter Brothers. We get about 18 events or 18 days where we have at least 1/10 of an inch precipitation over these months. And so if we're less than that, this is 2012 here. It really kind of highlights, or sorry, 2002 here. We're only about 4 or 5 days. And so as we talked about, we're a mixture of warm and cool season grasses out there. So that plays into this as well. And really, for our cool season grasses, the best models are April, May, June. And for our warm season grasses, the best models tend to be in just June and July. So we need that June precipitation on into July to really provide enough growth for those warm season grasses. And so this is just a graph that's kind of busy, but it shows all the amounts of both days with at least 1/10 of an inch of precipitation and total precipitation. And I hope that you guys have access to these, or you might have your own that you've had long term in this. But both of them can be useful. And so what I try to do here is I try to get an average as to where they're going to be. And then I say, where is it if it's below 75%? And where is it if it's 125%? Just to highlight some of the really wet and really dry years. Now, it's kind of hard to see here, but the really dry years are kind of this lighter color, the really wet years are this blue color here. But every one of those years where we have below 75% of the plant production is highlighted with a star here. And so what we've seen in these last 22 years or so is that a wet May and July can typically compensate for a dry winter. The opposite is not true. We could have a pretty wet winter, and if we had just really crashed in terms of our May, June, July precipitation, we're going to have a negative effect on our plant production. Probably going to be less severe if we had a good stock of soil moisture, but it's still critical we have those months. The other thing that we found is it's uncommon for July to make up for a May and June that's below average. Oftentimes, I've perpetual optimist when it comes to rain. You know, it's going to come, it's going to hit. But what we've seen, it's just likely not to happen. And that classic example is in 2012, where, you know, by the time we got to June, the 1st of July, we would have had to have 10 events. And on average, we only have about 5. And so we would have just had to have a tremendous year to see that. The only year we really saw this out of the bunch was in 18 here, where we had some pretty wet years, but that's pretty uncommon where we see that much in July. So I think it helps us to think realistically about what we can expect in terms of the amount of forage we have out there, and speak to our trigger dates. So I said I'd talk a little bit about 2017. Now, 2017 was this flash drought. You guys probably remember it. At Barter Brothers Ranch, where we have the data, we saw that it stopped raining about the 3rd or 4th week of May, and we really didn't see rains again until the 2nd week of July. And so we only had about 0.39 inches in 2 events, which was only about 10% of normal for that area. So this is how it kind of looked right here. So this is 2017 in the blue bars. The orange here is the average. So May actually was well above average. June was really below, and then July again was above average. But just that really dry 6-week period had a pretty profound effect on our warm season grasses. So our cool season grasses that year were average. They were really close to average. Did pretty well. But our warm season grasses only produced about 47% of what they would in a normal year. So there's that critical window for those warm season grasses to really take advantage of that precipitation. That if they don't, then even afterwards, there'll still be some growth. They'll still be able to hang on a little bit more. But as far as the biomass they're going to produce, it's pretty low. I'll just go through this one quick. This is just some work that we've done looking at different topographic positions, but basically these are the slopes lines here in terms of growing season precipitation, and it's pretty similar to what I reported on before about this is about between 70 and 90 pounds per inch per acre on the slopes. But the interdune swells just tend to do a lot better because they get a little bit more soil moisture and have a little bit more organic matter, and they tend to respond more positively to precipitation. So they're actually almost double for of what it is, about 160 pounds per inch per acre in the swells. Not really sub-irrigated, but kind of lower ground. So going back to this, I just want to kind of walk through this a little bit and think about this. So this is where we're at on average in our stocking rate would be somewhere in that neighborhood of about 0.65. And so this is kind of a trigger date that based on our data, this is kind of how, if we had a crystal ball, this is how I would probably do it is April and May, thinking about previous year precipitation. So 2001 and 2005 were both dry summers. So in the Panhandle, we had a pretty dry summer last year. So I'm already a little bit concerned going into this year because 2002, 2006 were really dry years. So if I'm thinking that, I'm kind of positioning myself in April and May to if we don't get precipitation by May 15th, I can make decisions, or I've already made those decisions. So May 15th, 2002, 2006, pretty dry by then still. So again, that's a good trigger point to say, boy, it's probably going to be dry the rest of the summer. If we think about another month, I said about 50% of that, our biomass is in June is the expectation. Well, our data would show that range is anywhere between 44% and 92% of the total production. So 2002, 92% of our growth happened by June 15th. So that means we only got 8% more biomass between June 15th and the middle of August in that really dry year. So it can be pretty variable there, and variable in terms of our warm season. So in really wet years, we have really a low amount of our warm season grass in June. In really dry years, we have quite a bit. So June 15th, I think, is a good point to kind of assess where we're at. July 15th, if June is exceptionally low, we just expect reduced plant production. Now it's probably going to be below that 75% of normal too. And then by July 15th, if below average precipitation persists, the expectation of additional growth on our warm seasons is really limited. It's rainfall after that's still good. You know, it's still important for those plants. They just don't put as much of it into above ground bio. And so these are just some ideas of some critical dates or action flow plans. And there's a few different resources I'll leave you. You can look at that. But just thinking through some of the management actions, and I won't get into these too far, but just having some of these ideas about where you want to be in terms of your interventions, when you want to make those decisions. I think it's really important to kind of think through these. You know, these are examples, and it's really based on what you have for resources and where you think you can be with some of these reductions.
Your last slide, there was a lot of good stuff on there. Like I only got halfway down, but there's a lot of neat ideas to implement that. That's a really cool flow chart I haven't seen.
And so this is an example of an area that has about, you know, we May and June about 7.7 inches of precipitation. So we kind of have a benchmark, and if it's 20 or so % above or below, we just figure that's great. You know, we're having a good year. But if we start seeing this is that 25% reduction in precipitation, then we need to start thinking. And this is maybe later than what we want to be making decisions, but this is really where we have this critical point where we probably need to think about this. So if it's less than half of our precipitation in May and June, then we need to have some pretty important reductions in place, probably, or options, more acres, feed, early weed. You know, there's a lot of different options. This is a study that was conducted in Wyoming, actually, and I thought it was kind of interesting. But they looked at both drought preparation and drought response, and they surveyed, I think it was over 300 people, producers there. And you know, they reserve forage supply was a theme that came up, where about 50% of them said they stocked conservatively. So they some of them stocked below what their average could be, just because they felt that gave them a little bit more buffer, a little bit more stockpiled grass, and better opportunities to rest pastures. And part of this tied into them being able to graze dormant season as well. So they're able to rest more of their pastures during the growing season and utilize that forage in the dormant season. Then they also vary stocking rate by forage supply. So about 30% of the producers have yearlings. And so that was how they managed the drought. They could get rid of the yearlings whenever they needed to conserve the forage. And then a smaller percentage used weather predictions and adjusted their stocking rate based on it. When it came to the drought response, this was what they did. So 80% of them, they reduced their herd size. And so they cold heavier. They weed calves early about 50%, then sell those yearlings about 24%. So kind of pretty close to what it was here. And then either they purchased feed, they rented additional pasture, a lot of these other variables that they used to help with the drought preparation and also the drought response. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into this too much, but I'll provide the slides if anybody wants to go back through them. This is just kind of a checklist and that they have in terms of the steps of drought planning. And so a lot of it is really setting objectives, having a vision, and then setting some of these trigger dates or setting some of these options out that could be used. They really highlight ranch inventory and ranch monitoring as really important aspects of a drought plan or being resilient to drought. Is kind of knowing where you're at, knowing your resources, knowing your challenges, so that when a drought hits, you're able to make different options. And then really monitoring and adapting. And so I like this idea of adaptive management or structured decision making, where you know we have these identified objectives, problems, you know, drought being one of them. You know, identifying your objectives. And so thinking through it as, you know, like I want to maintain my plant community as resilient as possible. I want to leave as much grass as I can possible during the drought so I can come out the other side quicker. How am I going to do that? You evaluate criteria, estimate outcomes. What are the trade-offs? I mean, there's financial trade-offs, there's herd trade-offs, there's health trade-offs, all these types of things that come into play. But a decision that eventually has to be made, how we implement and monitor that will help prepare us for the next, or after the drought, or for the next drought to be more resilient. Now I think I'll end here for a bit and just this. I really like this quote, and I think, you know, as I think about the history of our Great Plains, the history of our landscapes here, they're used to having large numbers of ungulates graze across them. And that's in wet years and in droughts, right? For thousands of years this happened. And so these ungulates have been important agents of change. If you think about Africa and the Serengeti, same kind of thing happening there. And so they can shift our ecosystems. They can change that spatial biodiversity heterogeneity and modulate how that plant recovers from drought, or areas recover from drought and other things. But that's an important part of it. So again, drought's always a concern, and it's always hard. But if anything, it's our plants are resilient to that. Typically, can bounce back if we manage them well. And so how we do that, it's a little bit challenging, but I think that's the hope of our grasslands, is that they've seen this before and they'll see it again. And our grasslands are trying to create those reserves, or that resiliency, to manage for that. So I'll end there. Do we want to take a short break, or then I can go into tools after this? But anybody have questions too?
There's one question online about where do producers go to help set up their own drought plan, which I bet you guys are going to be talking about.
And I'd just say, reach out. NRCS has some really great folks. Sandhill Task Force can help. We're more than happy. Here's all my contact information to kind of throw some ideas out there. Aaron, we've been having some phone calls with groups of people just to kind of talk about what we're seeing and do different, just what are some ideas, or what are some options we have out there. And those have been really fun too. So feel free to reach out. I will show here. I'll go through some tools that can be used that you guys can go and access online, freely available. And one of those is UNL Drought Ranch Plan. And that has, it's not the same publication I think you're thinking of, Shelley, but it does have a pretty good publication that gives some basic boxes that you could fill out that would say for trigger dates, for thinking through some of the options that are available, buy feed, stock, those types of things. And then we also have some UNL has some pretty good economists too that can help walk through some options. We have some of our economists can really help with drought insurance if that's something you're interested in, how to utilize drought insurance to help reduce the risk of these droughts as well. So please reach out. I'm more than happy